Okay, hi there everybody, it's Father Moo back again with another video in the small Eurorack system series. Today we're going to look at something different, which you can see on the screen. This is my little, I call it the passive pod. And it is a 4MS pod without any power supply, as you can see, which I have filled up completely with, or almost completely with, passive Eurorack modules. You might have seen recent instruments such as the Landscape Noon or the Error Instruments Passive Operator. Those are two little standalone instruments that don't have any power supply, but if you connect them to something that has CV and audio outputs, the energy infused in those outputs will actually drive the Noon or the passive operator itself. So I knew the Noon was in development when I started working on this. Mainly, I'd had a lot of passive modules over the years. I liked them because if I didn't have a remaining power plug, but I did have remaining space in my larger Eurorack, I would just stick a passive in there just to fill up the gap. It seemed better than putting in a blank panel with no functions at all. And even if I wasn't always sure what the functionality would do, I figured I'd find a use for it. And in many ways, I did. So after collecting so many passive modules over the years and always reworking my systems, I figured I would get the biggest unpowered 4MS pod I could find and just start adding passive modules to it over time. If my system really needed a module, I'd put it in. But if it didn't, I would move it over to here. So without further ado, let's just look at the rack as we have it right now. The one thing to keep in mind is, like the Noon and like the passive operator, they may be self-contained instruments, but they still need at least one other instrument to work with. So you should think of this as an expander. For example, if you owned one semi-modular synth, like the Arturia Matrix Brute, for example, you could send its CV and audio outputs into this expander. You could modulate the CV or do other things, and then send the signal back to the Matrix Brute and add functionality without... The advantage of using passive modules and unpowered systems is, number one, they're often cheaper because they don't require the power components to be built into them. And number two, they're very portable. So we'll talk about this expander of mine in a portable context as well. So yeah, let's dive in and examine the modules that we got. Let's go left to right. So this one is made by NF Modular. They're a new company. I found them on Reverb. And this is a distortion unit. You can see the saturate knob, and then it has an input and an output. So the kind of distortion that it does in a passive circuit is what we call diode clipping. It removes the bottom or the top half of a waveform. So it's an interesting little distortion effect. I have many tubes that I often use for distortion, but again, in an expander situation, it's an interesting function to have. Here's another one. It's kind of hard to read their name. Their name is Herzlich Modular. I also found them on Reverb. They're relatively new. This is a triple mute, so you send 3 ins and 3 outs, and you have these switches at the bottom here that you can press for clickless muting. In fact, this module can be installed upside down. It works both ways, and the labels are on it both ways, so it doesn't really have an up or a down. This one, you'll have seen a similar module in my other small Eurorack system. It's the Pinhole from Tenderfoot Electronics. Tenderfoot is a buddy of mine. He lives here in Taiwan as well. And this is the Pinhole. So this is 3 low-pass gates in 4 HP. It's probably the most used passive module of mine. I have 2 of them with 2 different colors of LEDs. But especially in the expander, this one is a can't miss. If I was going to get one passive module, I would get a passive low-pass gates. And this one is 3 and 4 HP. I've seen 2 HP versions that have 1 or even 2 low-pass gates crammed into them. And yeah, I mean, it's just a little, each of those gates is a little voice. So if you have a audio signal of any kind, you can turn it into a triggerable voice with the pinhole. Then we have this one here from Doepfer. It's the A182-4 rotary switches. This one is actually a really good partner for this bigger one over here. Basically, you send signal into the inputs, and there's one output, and you use a switch here to decide which of your multiple inputs will be sent to the output. So you can set up different situations over time. For example, you could have two sequencers going into the input and then switch between them using the switch, deciding which one will actually go to the output and feed, let's say, an oscillator. It's the kind of switch I use in the Nord Micro Modular all the time. I built mine using square waves to automate the function. This one doesn't have that ability, but still very useful. And here's another audio processor, kind of like the distortion and the triple low-pass gates. This is the Ringer from Tenderfoot Electronics. It's just two ring modulator circuits built into one. So you send in an in signal and a carrier signal, and then an output. I've got a video which will be coming up later in my January series where I have these two bottle synthesizers like built into glass bottles, and I send the two of their outputs into these two inputs, and the output is the ring modulated signal. Then we got this big guy. This guy is I always like to call them prestige modules. In this little case, he's definitely the big one. So this is also Hertzlick Modular, the same guy who made me the triple clickless mute. So you can send audio to this if you want. I have been sending CV to it more often. So what you can do is you can send your CV inputs here, and then you can decide the amount, and there's also like an on-off switch for each of those mixes, and then the output comes here. So you could have, let's say, two boring normal LFOs going into 1 and 2, and then you adjust the amounts that you have here, or even whether you want any at all with the switch, and then the output here will be a very strange LFO that's a mixture of the two of them. So the way I like to use this one with the Doepfer is, if I send these 4 weird CV outputs to the switch inputs, and then send that one output of the switch into the CV in of another module, I can change between which weird CV is going to be feeding it without like hot patching a cable or something like that. So this one is very big. It's a little bit on the expensive side based on its size and the parts you need for it, but I find it, if you're interested in creating strange LFOs, and Lord knows I certainly am, this is the way to do it. People often ask me if this loses a lot of signal. I would say the more you have plugged into it, the less it's going to bleed out. But it's not perfect. I think even if you set one knob here to 0, it might still bleed into the other voltages around it a little bit. So it's not like perfect math. It's not a razor blade. It's a bit more of a mishmash for CV and audio signals. But if you're interested in experimentation, it's very useful. In fact, people have been using mixers like this in synthesis for a very, very long time, just because the concept is simple, but the output is quite complex. Okay, here I have a mult, which is something I don't usually buy. When I realized that I wanted to use my bottle synthesizers with this passive pod, the bottle synthesizers, their output is a guitar-sized patch cable, and this one just converts those to normal Eurorack size and vice versa. So yeah, it's basically just for changing the size of the cable. It's also a mult, so if I wanted to send one of the oscillators into here, I could have multiple outputs of it. So yeah, it has that function as well. It's not a powered multiple, so each of the outputs is going to lose a little bit of the power. But again, that's the way it goes with passive. Here we have an attenue mix, which is a strange name for a pretty simple function. Number one, it can be a mixer for CV or audio. And number two, it can be an attenuator, which just means the amount of something. So if you send a LFO in here and you want to send the out into a module that has a CV in but doesn't have an amount knob for how much the CV will affect it, you can use the knob here to adjust the amount and solve that problem for you. Here we have another one from NF Modular, the somewhat flashy looking mixer. This one's kind of big for its size, but I kind of didn't really mind. I needed something to... This one I definitely use as an audio mixer, whereas the other ones are mostly for CV. If I have multiple, for example, gates coming out of the pinhole, I send those voices into here, adjust their levels, and then send this to my output. And then finally here at the end, these are also from NF. These are pressure-sensitive attenuators. So you send some CV signal in to here, and you send the out from there to its destination. And then when you make physical contact with the little pattern on here, it will reduce the amount of CV going through. So in some way you could say it's like this attenuator, except that it's actually like pressure controlled. I mounted these two together so I could, sort of play them both at the same time. And by keeping them at the edge of the system, if they were in the middle here, somewhere like this, there'd be all these knobs and cables in the way. But keeping them over here where nothing is going to cross over them, I have the freedom to sort of play with it and interact with it. So this is not as complex as other touch-sensitive systems out there, such as the ones from Make Noise and other people, but it's an interesting way just to add some playability to the module. And again, I bought them mostly as an experiment. I was looking at passive stuff. I never thought a touch-sensitive panel could be done in that kind of circuit, and it turned out this one was, so I said, great, let's try it out. So yeah, that's my whole little expander, as I say. My final reason for putting this together was I like to be portable and I like to take my gear outside, hence the original name of my channel. So you could take this and a couple of my bottles, or maybe a Volca, or like a Korg Monotron, one of those little battery-powered synths, and you could hook them up to this and add some more functionality and get some more weird CVs going. Of course, that depends on the inputs and outputs of the device you connect to it. But as you can see here, even when the device had different sized cables, I found an adapter that could get around that problem. And the final reason I find it so useful is in my house, there's just not a lot of power cables. In fact, I often have one synth set up on one part of my room and another in another. And due to like the power limitations, I may not be able to have them all on at once. So with this little passive pod, I was able to add functionality without requiring yet another plug to go into the wall. So I just pick it up from one system and move it over to another system, or take it outside and set up a portable thing. It gives me that flexibility without having to worry about the power cabling getting in the way. I was pleasantly surprised to see the Landscape Noon and the Error Instruments passive operator come out. The passive operator was just a few months ago. The Noon has been out for about a year, and it was interesting to see them come out, and I was happy to see that other people were experimenting with passive concepts the way I was doing. I started this one about 9 months ago, and mine has definitely evolved. I had a plan for it in the beginning, mostly based around the big guy here, but it evolved over time, and I think that's the advantage of modular. You find the pieces that fit for you, and the things that don't go together the way you figured they would, they may find their way into something else in the end, such as this. So yeah, again, if you want to see the passive pod in action, just keep watching my January videos. It definitely shows up. If you see a bottle in the video, it will probably have this connected to it somewhere. So yeah, thanks for taking the time. I'd love to hear your feedback. As far as I know, I've never heard of anyone building a completely passive case like this. Not that I'm saying I invented the idea. I'm just saying there's so many Eurorack assemblers out there and hobbyists. And, 4MS is selling this powerless pod, but I never saw anyone say, yeah, I decided to put all passive modules in it. They usually have other situations, such as the few modules that sometimes have their own power supplies. So yeah, if you've built a passive case or a passive overflow box, I would love to hear about it, just because I haven't heard about any others before. So yeah, that's it. Father Moo signing off. We'll be back with more January later this month. Thank you so much. Peace.